For years, Palestine has been at the center of poverty, victimization, and a constant sense of injustice. Today, these lands are not just a geography. They also carry the story of displacements, forced migrations, and shattered lives. Families moved, villages were emptied, and people were torn from the lands where they were born. Relations with Israel, conflicts, and the endless state of war emerge today not just as a regional issue, but as a global one. There is a common opinion about this matter. Palestinians sold their land to the Jews. So is that really the case? Today, we will not give a short answer to this question. On the contrary, we will try to understand the historical process behind this claim. And for this, we will start not from today, but from the past, more accurately from the period of the Ottoman Empire. In the 16th century, the Ottomans dominated the region. They didn't just station their soldiers. They brought order to the region. They established a system that shaped the life of the land and the people. The state was the landowner. Peasants worked the land, but ownership belonged to the state. The name of the system was Müşâ. Land was not an investment tool for the peasants. It was life itself. All the land of the village was used in common by the people. Everyone had a share, but no one owned a specific piece of the land. Over the years, the land would be cultivated alternately among different families. Access to fertile and infertile land was provided equally. The rhythm of life revolved around this sharing. Müşâ kept not only production, but also society in balance. No one was left without land. Risks and gains were shared. Solidarity formed the basis of the village. The state, as the landowner, ensured the continuation of order but did not interfere in the daily lives of the peasants. Thus, life in Palestinian villages flowed around planting, harvesting, neighborhood, and family relations, intertwining with the land. This order secured the lives of the peasants for centuries. Müşâ remained one of the cornerstones of Palestine's historical fabric. The Ottoman Empire had kept the land and the peasant in balance with the Müşâ system for centuries. But by the 19th century, the empire realized it could no longer continue with the old order. The Ottoman Empire had to modernize. It wanted to strengthen central authority, organize the tax system, and bring military obligations under control. Because now the issue was not just the cultivation of the land, but the state's ability to record everything. Who lives where? Who owns how much land? Who will pay how much tax? All of this was uncertain. At this exact point, the state wanted to make the land more visible and controllable. This became possible with the land code issued in 1858. With this law, land began to become not just a cultivated area, but also a property officially recorded. For the state, this was a step toward modernization, but it was not yet clear how this change would be received on the ground, especially in the villages. However, this change did not work out as it appeared on paper. For the peasants, the issue was entirely different. They had been cultivating the land for centuries, but they had never had to officially register it in their own names. Now, the state was asking them for this. But for the peasant, getting a title deed was not just a matter of rights. It also meant more taxes. It also meant military service. Therefore, many peasants avoided registering the land in their own names, and this is where the system began to break. Peasants turned to the local notables they trusted. Instead of registering their lands in their own names, they registered them under the powerful, large landowners in the region. Or these large families accepted taking these records under their own names. These families, living in Damascus and Beirut, were closer to the state, knew the system, and could move within this new order. But there was a consequence. The peasant continued to cultivate the land, but they were no longer the legal owner of that land. The land stayed in place. The peasant stayed in place. But ownership had quietly changed hands. At this point, a new actor was entering the scene. The large landowners in the region, especially the wealthy families living in Damascus and Beirut. Some of these families were groups that had established close relations with the Ottoman bureaucracy, grown wealthy through trade, and read the new system well. Among them were also large families of Greek origin. They had gained power through banking, trade, and the relations they established with the state. For the peasants, these families were a gateway of trust, because they knew the state, they knew the laws, and they could act within the new system. Therefore, many peasants registered their land under these large families, instead of in their own names. But over time, this situation gained a different meaning. For these families, land was no longer just a cultivated area, but a property that could be bought and sold. Land, which was a living space for the peasant, began to turn into a value, an investment for the notables. And thus, for the first time in Palestine, the bond between the land and the person cultivating it began to weaken. And at this exact point, another actor was entering the scene. Jews seeking a safe homeland, with the nationalist movement rising from the West. The Zionist groups that started coming to Palestine from the 1880s onwards were not chasing romantic dreams. Behind them were large financiers like Rothschild, the institutional structure of the World Zionist Organization, and a systematic land acquisition strategy. And these two sides met on a very quiet, very legal ground. The notables wanted to sell and the Zionists wanted to buy. The Ottoman title deed system made this exchange possible. On paper, everything was completely legal, but there was one party not at the table, the peasants. They had established an organic bond with the land through Müşâ, which had lasted for generations. However, according to the Ottoman title deed system, the land was now registered in the name of the notables. The peasant had no legal right over that land. As soon as the land changed hands, the new owners told the peasants, "This land is now ours. You are tenants here. We plan to use this land differently." This was the breaking point of the land issue in Palestine. Not by war, but by a notary process. A right on paper had devalued the thousands of years of labor of the peasant. Zionist settlement was not limited to just buying land. From the 1880s onwards, a planned and systematic settlement strategy was put into effect in Palestine. Each new settlement aimed not only to acquire land, but also to change the demographic and economic structure of the region. Small villages, valleys, and coastal areas were strategically selected. Water resources, transportation routes, and agricultural areas were taken into account. Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid noticed this process and tried to intervene. He restricted some land sales. He put bureaucratic obstacles in place to stop new settlement plans. But pressures from Europe, financial powers, and the chaos in the Ottoman bureaucracy often left his interventions ineffective. When World War I came, Ottoman dominance was completely shaken, and the region entered a new era. Zionist settlement movements gained momentum. Now, not just individual land purchases, but permanent settlement areas and infrastructure projects were being put into action. The peasants in Palestine had been distanced from the organic bonds they had established with Müşâ and had largely lost control over their lands. After the Balfour Declaration, when Britain established the Mandate administration, the ground changed completely for the Zionist movement. Now, there was no need to wander through the labyrinths of the Ottoman bureaucracy or negotiate with intermediaries in Damascus to buy land. The British Mandate administration provided a legal framework for Jewish immigration and land acquisitions. The money was ready. The Jewish National Fund Keren Kayameth, established within the World Zionist Organization, was a tool created for this purpose. It collected donations, bought land, and declared the lands it acquired as permanent Jewish property. Once land passed to the fund, it could not be sold or rented again, and no non-Jew could be employed on it. This mechanism worked extremely patiently and systematically. Most of the lands were still coming from the large landowners of Beirut and Damascus. The Sursock family sold the vast lands in the to the Jewish National Fund. For them, this was an exit opportunity, a real estate transaction whose value was appraised, negotiated, and documented. But for the peasants living on that land, this process carried a completely different meaning. When the land changed hands, the message sent to the peasants was clear. This land is now the property of the Jewish National Fund. Only Jewish workers can work here. The fellahin, peasants, who had cultivated that land for generations, lost both their land and their livelihood by a notary decision. They had nowhere else to go. Thus, a new order was being established in Palestine. The ancient bond between the ownership of the land and the people who cultivated it was being systematically severed. The peasants were now merely tenants in the fields where they once freely planted and harvested in their own villages. The root of the disagreement and conflict that has persisted for years lies in this change of hands of the lands without asking their people.